to another live stream. I'm going to discuss here the isolation of Crimea, the occupied territory in the south of Ukraine, the peninsula. That was a strategic achievement when Vladimir Putin illegally seized it and illegally annexed it back in 2014. And it was an achievement that led to his relatively poor popularity ratings peaking at the time. And it is a part of de jure Ukrainian territory that had a lot of symbolic value to Russians in general because been part of the Russian Empire, and many Russians have been there on holidays. It was very popular for Russians to go there during the Soviet times, Russian imperial times, and in fact, when it was under Ukrainian control as well. There were many Russians there. I've been to the peninsula myself before 2014, probably about 4, maybe even 5 times. And I did go to a little sliver of territory that's technically the Kherson Oblast called the Arabat Spit back in 2021, which for me, it's geographically speaking Crimea, but it was still under Ukrainian control. So I've been able to look at it physically as well, the occupied parts from there on the Arabat Spit. Obviously, that is something that's not currently possible for me to do because the territory that I was in is now also under a Russian occupation, as it was in Kherson Oblast. So dramatic events have been happening with respect to Crimea. I think pretty early on with the 2022 invasion, Ukraine targeted what's known as the Kerch Bridge or the Crimean Bridge. And that is an illegally constructed bridge by the Russian Federation connecting Russia proper with occupied Crimea. It's also a strategic achievement. Putin, I'm pretty sure, drove across it maybe as the first person on the opening. And they didn't take the bridge down, but they did structurally weaken the bridge. And as a result, transport over this bridge has been limited. It's still open, but it has been limited. Now, with the 2022 invasion, the Russian forces came out of Crimea and also came down from Rostov-on-Don, and they had the sack of Mariupol, where they besieged it and then basically destroyed most of the city. And they created this land bridge to connect Crimea through Ukrainian territory to actually Russia de jure, so Russia proper. So that was possibly, I would say, from my point of view, the only strategic achievement by Russia since the 2022 invasion. They failed to take Kyiv and overthrow the government, install their own puppet government. They have failed to take any regional capital, although Mariupol was a significantly big city, but they destroyed it in doing so. They've taken our city, Melitopol, without destroying it. That's probably maybe the biggest, a little bit over 100,000 people there living in that city pre-invasion. I've been there also myself to Melitopol back in the day. And now we have this land bridge, and they use that to transport material, supplies for both civilians and the military from Russia all the way down using that land bridge to the Crimean Peninsula. It is not an island, it is a peninsula. It's connected at a couple of points to mainland Ukraine. However, Ukraine in the last few months has been very successful in interdicting traffic along the main highway, which runs along the Sea of Azov. It's also occupied completely by the Russian Federation at the moment. And the situation is getting worse and worse for the Russian Federation to be able to supply Crimea at all, because Ukraine has developed the capability with mid-range drones to hit vehicles that are going along that highway. And Russia's air defense has been significantly softened up in the last few months in order for the Ukrainians to be able to do that pretty freely. And now there are restrictions, rations in occupied Crimea, in all of occupied Ukraine, and parts of Russia de jure that are bordering onto the occupied parts of Ukraine, or bordering onto Ukraine in general. So this is creating an effect in Crimea, which suggests that the strategy by Ukraine is not currently to try and seize the peninsula. That would be extremely difficult, although they are making some progress in that direction quite recently with counterattacks. I would not say that there's yet a counteroffensive, although I am leaning that direction that Ukraine is actually going to launch something a little bit similar to the Kursk offensive back, I think it was in 2024, where they seized parts of Kursk in Russia de jure. And they may do something similar, launch a counteroffensive and try and grab parts that are occupied in the Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblast. We just have to see what happens, whether they have the capability to do that this summer or in, say, the spring of 2027. In the meantime, the strategy is to isolate the Crimean Peninsula, make it extremely difficult to resupply for the military, and as a corollary of that, for people who are living there, if you think about it, it was a part of Ukraine that was very reliant on tourism. That's obviously been in decline anyway since 2014, but now there probably aren't going to be too many people thinking of a holiday in Crimea, presumably coming from the Russian Federation, if they're unlikely to have any fuel because they might end up stuck there, marooned in the Crimean Peninsula. And if this continues, Russia may be more and more dependent on actually using the Kerch Bridge, and it's not clear whether the structure will hold up, or it's not clear whether Ukraine will actually strike it again, just take out that bridge completely once they have completed their objective of controlling the main highway that runs along the Sea of Azov in this land corridor. So this is the strategy that Ukraine is employing. They have rolled it out over the last month or two, and it is causing a fuel crisis in Crimea, supply crisis. And you have to think that Ukraine has been hitting Russian oil terminals, their energy infrastructure, and that is, of course, contributing to the lack of petrol or gas that they are able to use in Russia and in the occupied territories, and most importantly in Crimea. This would indicate that if you look at how badly Vladimir Putin has been humiliated in the past month or two, first we had May 9th parade where he had to call up Donald Trump and request that he ask Zelensky not to bomb the May 9th parade in Moscow. That already was a humiliating experience for Putin, and the display on TV where there was no hardware, no military hardware, and there were North Korean troops marching and a few Russian troops really was the most underwhelming May 9th parade of Vladimir Putin's entire presidency. And then we had his St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, which is to showcase Russia, the Russian Federation, as a place to invest. Day one, the Ukrainians hit the oil terminal and a Russian corvette that was, I think it was on Kronstadt Island, but it was just off the coast of St. Petersburg. So those people who were invited, not talking about the influencers or people who do media, but the actual people who were invited from abroad to invest and to come and consider Russia for investment so they can get their hands on that foreign capital. They would have been greeted on the first day with billowing black smoke across the city coming from the oil terminal. And I'm sure if they were considering investing in Russia, that definitely was a huge red flag for them about continuing to do so. So that would have cost Russia significantly. Plus, it is Vladimir Putin's hometown. It is a premier event, international event in the city. And that is just another doubling down by Ukraine on the humiliations for Vladimir Putin. And now he's looking at his only strategic achievement with this invasion in 2022 and his biggest military achievement, shall we say, in seizing Crimea in a pretty successful operation in 2014, that is starting to be undone. First, it will be the land corridor, and then eventually the idea is to get Crimea back. It's classic military doctrine to isolate a piece of land, piece of territory that can be done so to soften it up for a long time. And maybe Ukraine will even be able to get it back under their control without actually having to seize the peninsula, because that will be a very complicated military operation. But the first thing is just cut it off and make it a big liability for Russia to actually try to resupply, because then they're going to have to get boats, ferries to resupply. Of course, Ukraine is probably going to start hitting them as well. There has been accusations that Russia is now switching to trying to use civilian vehicles to bring supplies. That, of course, creates a scenario where if there is intel that they are carrying supplies in such vehicles, that Ukraine will start to hit those. This then will bring up the image of maybe some what look like civilian cars or vehicles being destroyed, and that will further discourage civilians from the Russian Federation to go there, or locals they would consider leaving, because life will become more untenable, and the Russian defense of it will become harder and harder to maintain. So that's what I see in terms of the big development at the moment in this Russo-Ukrainian war. On the battlefield, we have Russia making almost no progress, but they're still attacking in Donbass, tried to get one of the fortress cities. Again, it will take them many years to actually achieve that strategic objective of controlling all of the Donbass region at the current pace, whilst Ukraine is taking back some territory slowly in the direction of the land bridge to Crimea through the Zaporizhia Oblast. And we may see, as I said, later this summer, an offensive by Ukraine, or maybe it'll be next spring. But they have been working on new doctrine to incorporate the evolution of drone warfare. That's something also that the former commander of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Zaluzhny, referred to back, it would have been probably in 2023, that really this war would need some sort of technological plus strategic evolution so that they can implement the new technology, a bit like in World War I, would say things like tanks and aircraft, which were pretty new at the time, in order for one side to gain an advantage to actually be able to make a breakthrough in a war of attrition. Russia's in a lot of trouble. I've said it many times on this channel. You got the three M's, you got manpower, money, and material. And they're starting in big troubles with all of those three last year, and that is only compounding as their economy gets weaker and weaker. So, looking forward, because we have a lot going on the diplomatic track, it looks like from the outside that perhaps there will be some sort of ceasefire to have negotiations. The European allies of Ukraine, Zelensky, have set it up that way, and we had a call yesterday, apparently by phone, with Stevie Witkoff, the hapless negotiator for both peace in the Middle East and peace in Ukraine, along with Jared Kushner. So we will have to see. My hunch is that since Vladimir Putin has consistently been making blunders, basically, since 2022, the sensible thing for him to do at this juncture would actually to be go for a ceasefire, disingenuously negotiate and prepare for the next phase of the war. However, that might be problematic, that he suspects that Ukraine will use the time better than him, like they did with the Minsk II agreements from around 2015 to 2022, in terms of rearming and being prepared to resist the next phase of the war, which was the 2022 Russian invasion. So he may go for another option, which is mobilization. Of course, he can escalate against a NATO state. He could escalate here in Ukraine with more atrocities. He can escalate maybe against a non-NATO state. I mean, Armenia, for example, they had elections on Sunday, and the victor is the incumbent. And yeah, he's basically turning Armenia towards the European Union, and Putin has already, like a mobster, warned him in that he faces a Ukraine scenario. Well, what does that mean? It means an invasion by Russia, but Russia doesn't have a border with Armenia, so they would presumably have to go through maybe Georgia, because they have a fine government there. But still, that's a lot of speculation. But there are lots of ways from the escalate. The key one in terms of the war directly is going for another mobilization. He did it back in autumn 2022 when 300,000 Russians were forced into coming here to Ukraine into the army. He hasn't done that since, because 1 million Russian men left, and it was deeply unpopular. So he went for paying people exorbitant amounts of money to sign up, but they are now losing more soldiers than they're able to recruit every month. And that is a big problem for the Russian Federation. Marco Rubio stated that current KIA numbers are 5 times higher for the Russian Federation than they are for Ukraine. So that would suggest that that is not sustainable for much longer. It could be just also part of it that the Russians who get injured just they're not able to evacuate them. They just die in the battlefield in way higher numbers than Ukrainians would in the same scenario. So maybe the casualty numbers aren't quite 5 to 1. Maybe they're closer to 3 to 1, like we've been experiencing war. It's been 2.5 to 1 is the best estimate. 2.5 more Russians have been casualties than on the Ukrainian side. So that is what I think Vladimir Putin will probably do. It would actually be a bad course of action. The best course of action he'd probably do is to stop it. But all of this comes with uncertainty. And it would be better for him to stop it because then he could try to undermine Ukraine further during an uneasy peace. But as I said, it failed that strategy from 2015 to 2022 with Minsk II. So that's what has me thinking. He set up the structure to call for a bigger mobilization. That's probably what he's going to do. Could be the summer, it could be the autumn, but he needs to do something before winter because he's not going to likely have any progress in the battlefield. In fact, they're probably going to lose more territory. I mean, no closer to a strategic achievement. In fact, they're going to be further away. The economy is going to be in a worse state. So that's what leads me to believe that either he's going to, well, he's going, it will be either some escalation or there will be a ceasefire. That's kind of like almost the dichotomy in any case. But I'm thinking that attacking somewhere like Armenia will be very complicated. Attacking a state brings a lot of risk as well, especially since I anticipate that it will be unsuccessful. So increasing the bomb attacks on Ukraine probably in the next few months before the Ukrainians have an alternative for the Patriot missiles. They are working on that. They tested a prototype last week, so maybe before the end of the winter, we're actually going to have to fully implement it, and that will remove that ability for Russia. So they may go for that in the short term. However, none of this will be as powerful as going for a mobilization. So that is probably what's going to happen so that you can keep it going. However, in the meantime, Crimea will be more and more isolated, and his one strategic achievement since this 2022 invasion will be effectively nullified since they won't be able to use it anymore pretty soon. They will have it still on paper under occupation, but it will cease to have that purpose, which is to resupply the Crimean Peninsula without having to go across the bridge across border. And if that's taken away, you also have to remember Ukraine has been very successful with sea drones, so they can also possibly use those to get into the Sea of Azov and then hit whatever ferries they're using to come across. They can weaken the bridge again, maybe even take it down, and then completely cut off the Crimean Peninsula 100% and humiliate Vladimir Putin even further. So I'll leave it at that for today. You see, the sunshine is out again in Odessa, Mama. Got the Odessa Opera House and this fountain just behind me, and it is beautiful weather. It was actually raining a little bit earlier for a little bit, just we had a shower, but we are in the height of summer, and people are here, in spite of everything, doing their best to enjoy this beautiful weather and looking forward to seeing further humiliations of the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin. So on that note, I'll say Slava Ukraini, do peremoni.